Well, welcome. I'm Scott Knickerbocker. I'm professor of English and Environmental Studies here at the College of Idaho, and most of these people right in here are the Environmental Studies Senior Capstone class. It's a large group this year, 16. This spring they focused on wolf reintroduction to Idaho and Yellowstone National Park. Before white settlement, wolves lived nearly everywhere in North America, but were practically eliminated from the landscape in the 20th century US. In fact, it was US government policy to exterminate the wolf, considered not only a threat to the livestock industry and a dangerous pest, but the embodiment of evil itself. With a greater understanding of the wolf's importance to healthy ecosystems, in 1995 and 1996, the federal government, with the majority of public support, reintroduced wolves trapped in Canada to Yellowstone National Park and the mountains of central Idaho. At the same time, many rural Westerners, especially ranchers and hunters, have fiercely opposed the reintroduction of wolves, which they see as a threat to livestock as well as to elk populations. Wolf reintroduction provides us with a fascinating case study of the ongoing challenges and controversies associated with restoration ecology. Wolf reintroduction is also, especially in Idaho, intensely political and linked to tensions between state and federal governance. Wolf reintroduction is ultimately a dramatic story about humans more than wolves themselves. Competing human interest groups, hunters, ranchers, biologists, environmentalists, embattled visions of land management, and conflicting worldviews. Are wolves evil, sacred, neither? Will Idaho succeed in the long term at accommodating both humans and wolves on the land? We're in the middle of this ongoing drama. 10 years after their reintroduction, wolves had reestablished themselves more successfully than anyone had anticipated. And in 2008-9, they were removed from the endangered species list, thereby placing wolves from federal back into state management. Idaho currently has a hunting season on wolves. If wolf populations dip too low, they could be put back on the endangered species list and thereby back in the hands of the federal government. Environmental studies is an interdisciplinary field, and the students here will give a presentation on wolves that incorporates multiple lenses: conservation biology, political economy, cultural and social analysis. As nature writer Barry Lopez puts it, the wolf is ultimately irreducible. It resists being understood through merely one or two lenses. We must try to understand the wolf from as many perspectives as possible. It has been a pleasure thinking through the complex, fascinating, still and perhaps always incomplete story of wolf reintroduction with this bright and lively bunch of students. So without further ado, this is their presentation. They'll take it away. 4 different angles on wolf reintroduction. Please do ask questions if you have a question afterwards, and help yourself to food as well. Thanks for coming.
So I'm Brittany Brown, and this is Carrot Tonning. We're going to be talking about wolf biology. Maybe. We might be. So to begin with, we kind of wanted to give a rough outline of pack relationships. The average wolf pack size is about 3 to 15 animals with a mean size of about 8 to 10. Somewhere in that region. Generally, wolf packs have one mating pair, and the packs consist of their offspring. Occasionally, there will be siblings of the mating pair that will actually make it into the pack and remain there for quite some time. And every now and then, there will be the unrelated member that will be in the pack, and that's relatively rare, but it does happen. If wolves are going to disperse, it'll generally happen before they reach 3 years old, and the reason for that is because then the pack hierarchy hasn't quite been established yet. And so if they're going to disperse, they'll generally do it as young adults. Since wolves are highly social animals, they do have a highly in-depth pack hierarchy. The first one would be the alpha male and female. These are the mating pair of the pack. Generally, these ones are in charge of everything that goes on, from hunting to moving to new rendezvous sites. Generally, they establish like a pack order of like who gets to eat first and whatnot. The second member would be the beta, who is the second in the command. Generally, if the alpha male or female dies, the beta just moves right into that position. and assumes the role. Also, if there's offspring, they're generally the babysitters or the ones that take care of them, while the others are out doing their thing and whatnot. The third member that is most often noted is the omega member, who is pretty much the opposite of the alpha. He's the lowest of the low, the last to eat, generally not very, generally gets picked on if they're going to get picked on at all within the pack. Packs are highly social. They communicate in a lot of different ways. One way is in body language. Generally, the best way to describe this would be the differences between the alpha male and the omega male. The alpha male will generally have ears erect, tail up, very high posture, whereas the omegas will generally be very low to the ground when they approach other members, tail between their legs, in a very submissive position. Wolves also have a lot of different vocalizations that are similar to dogs that go from whimpering to growling, whatnot. The most popular being howling. Wolves howl for about 3 different reasons. To locate other pack members that have wandered off during hunting or whatever reason. To tell other packs where they're at to avoid coming into contact with each other. And also some studies have shown that it's a type of bonding experience that they have. When wolves hunt, they hunt together as a pack, obviously. When they generally don't go after the strongest, biggest animal. It's very unbeneficial for a wolf to be injured. If it does get injured, it's probably not going to survive. So rather than going for the biggest, toughest looking bull elk, they're probably going to go for the weak, the old, the sick. And they generally pick these out through locating, observing, stalking, trial and error, more or less. Generally, they'll prey upon the weakest, as I said. Livestock kind of fall into this category because we've breeded a lot of livestock's ability to defend themselves out of them, and therefore they become pretty easy targets. Wolves live in territories that can range anywhere from 35 to 800 square miles, and this usually depends upon the habitat quality. If they live in poor quality environments, they'll generally expand their range so they can find food sources to sustain them. Generally, these packs are or territories are very well-rounded, and they're marked by scent marking and howling. In order to avoid inter-pack aggression, the wolves will howl to let them know where the other ones are, and generally, if they do come into contact with each other, they will fight, and members from either pack will be killed or severely injured, which is highly unbeneficial. Because of this, they try to keep a little bit of a buffer zone, a bit of a difference between the packs, and generally most research has found that the prey animals such as the elk will move in between these zones, and so they'll move out of the wolf territory because they can hear the wolves howl. They know, oh, there's wolves here, maybe we should move into this area and be a little bit safer. One of the big issues that has to deal with wolf reintroduction is the genetic diversity of wolves. Originally, before genetics was around, when taxonomists came into the area and were looking at wolves, they noticed that the ones farther north were a little bit larger, which is actually a biological factor that plays into it. And so they classified them into 2 different subspecies. However, when genetics became a popular thing and they reevaluated the wolves, they found that they're actually a very similar subspecies and reclassified them as the same species. Therefore, a lot of the arguments that you do hear about wolves being Canadian wolves, they were true at one point, but they're not necessarily true now in biological terms. When wolves were eradicated from the United States in the early 1900s, it really made a big impact on genetic diversity, which we're still suffering from a little bit now. And then the other issue is that wolves were kind of reintroduced when they shouldn't have been, and the thing is that they are a natural species here. They were here originally, and when they were eradicated, they were starting to make a natural return in northern Montana. When they did decide that they were going to do the return, they were looking for scientists were looking for a minimum viable population, which is the minimum number of wolves that they can have in an ecosystem and still have a surviving number. Generally, they're looking for about 100 years of survival when they do this. When they started to do wolf reintroduction, they were looking for about 300 individuals. The main reason that they wanted this many was to avoid issues such as inbreeding or suffering if there was a genetic or a natural disaster or anything like that. And because they are such small populations in Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, connectivity is crucial. If something happens and they're cut off from dispersal, that makes them that much more susceptible to diseases and inbreeding and issues that should probably be avoided. Larger populations are more likely to survive these types of issues.
So another topic that is fairly important to talk about when you talk about wolf reintroduction is their impact on what is called a trophic cascade. And so just by definition, general definition, a trophic cascade is essentially either the presence or the absence of a top predator having an influence on the abundance of the lower trophic levels, populations. And just to explain that a little bit, a trophic level is essentially a level in the food chain. And so what that means in terms of wolves and their reintroduction is that the presence of wolves will have an effect on the lower levels in the food chain, such as elk, and then the elk will have an effect on the lower level as well, which would be vegetation, especially woody plants such as aspens, willows, and cottonwoods. And so understanding what a trophic cascade actually does is important due to their impacts on areas such as riparian zones. And a riparian zone, by definition, is essentially just the interface between terrestrial and aquatic systems or ecosystems. They're very important because they support a high level of biodiversity, and they actually play a lot of different roles in the ecosystem as well. Some of these roles include they cool the stream, they keep it at a preferable temperature due to the shading that the vegetation creates. They also are a source of a lot of food and habitat for many species, especially elk, which I'll talk about later. And they also limit erosion due to the kind of interconnectivity of the root system. And so they keep a bank essentially from, there's a water source and a bank and then kind of your vegetation area. And so I'm not sure if you can see these pictures very clearly, but some of the impacts that wolves have on trophic cascades that they've looked at, especially in Yellowstone and areas in Idaho, are that the absence of wolves allowed the elk population to increase substantially because they weren't being predated on as much. And so with an increased population comes an increase of browsing, and so that definitely deteriorated riparian zones. The first picture was taken they're both taken in Yellowstone, I'm not sure if you can see it, but you can see that there's not very much vegetation. The bank is also very much deteriorated. And then once wolves were reintroduced, their presence helps keep the elk population in check. And so it decreases it, which will again decrease the browsing, which allows the vegetation to kind of recover and the riparian zones to recover. And you can see with the arrows, you can see that there's a bank beginning to form once again, and also vegetation. And since the riparian zones are becoming healthier, they kind of are able to support more biodiversity and just a healthier ecosystem overall. Although the reintroduction of wolf is one explanation that kind of explains why elk populations have decreased recently. There are also other explanations that are being kind of researched. Some of these include drought, harsher winters. Other top predators will also predate on elk. It's not solely wolves. And also human hunting could have an impact. And there's also research being done about climate change and its effect on growing seasons. Since it is getting warmer, growing seasons are becoming longer, which allows riparian vegetation to kind of become more abundant and grow for longer periods of time. And not only do do wolves affect the population of elk, but they also affect kind of some of their behaviors, and the primary behavior that's affected essentially is habitat selection. The presence of wolves puts a lot of pressure on elk, and it kind of has moved them out of open meadow areas or riparian zones where they were kind of safe when wolves were gone, but now that wolves are back, it's much more dangerous, so they move into more marginal kind of territories. And then elk are a big thing, but wolves also will influence or have impacts on other species. The prime example of this would be a mesopredator release. So that can kind of be defined as if the top predator has been taken out of an ecosystem, the predators below them have the chance to kind of increase in population. And the classic example here in the western United States is the coyote population. And this will create kind of an imbalance in the ecosystem because of the amount of prey that is actually available for the numbers of predators. And so with the wolves coming back, this has allowed the coyote population to decrease to a more kind of equilibrium level. And then other benefits, I guess, of wolves for other species involve carcasses. Wolves will leave their carcass, they won't eat the entire elk or other game that they kill, and that's really beneficial to scavenger species. Scavenger species use it as their primary food source. And then also surplus killing is something that can occur with wolves if there is... Ooh. Trying to keep the entertainment up. I'm just going to keep going. And so basically, as I was saying, surplus killing can occur with wolves, and that kind of occurs in two different ways. One of it is if there's miscommunications while packs are hunting, and also if they're training their young to kill. Unfortunately, the carcasses aren't always eaten by those wolves, but other species will benefit, so it's not a total loss. And that's all we have for the biology part.
Okay, hi, my name is Katie Stewart. This is Stevie Alotag, and then Allison Parrish was also in our group, and we're going to be discussing the role of cultural implications of wolf reintroduction in Idaho and in Yellowstone. Okay, so first of all, how Dr. Knickerbocker was talking about the history of the wolf and the history of human beings that have been living on this land for generations are intricately intertwined. And so the wolf debate takes a lot of different, lots of different paths depending on who you talk to. And so the opinions of each of these groups highly influence the wolf debate, and they're highly colored by the cultural perceptions that people have of the wolf. So in order to talk about this, we chose three different interest groups in the wolf debate. First, we talked about Native Americans, specifically the Nez Perce Indian tribe, which was very integral in the reintroduction of wolves. Second, we talked about environmentalists and conservationists. And third, we talked about hunters and ranchers. And so within each of these groups, we kind of focused on the extremists just to talk about where the wolf debate is really heating up. So firstly, for the Native Americans, specifically Nez Perce, there are three main points that we wanted to discuss in talking about their cultural perceptions of the wolf. So the first is that the wolf is a religious and a spiritual symbol. Within tribes that are more hunters and gatherers, the wolf is very highly revered, whereas the ones that are relying on subsistence agriculture, they're much less revered. This particularly applies to the Nez Perce Native Americans. Their creation story is actually, it starts out with humans being created from a wolf. And so a man wolf is created, and from his tail is created the females. And so this kind of talks about how the Nez Perce really thinks that the wolves are their kin, and they're actually their ancestors. The second main point that we wanted to discuss was how Native Americans actually identify with the wolf. Firstly, because of the persecution that both of them faced back when the wolves were extirpated and the Native Americans were really persecuted. And so they consider them kin in that way as well. There's also this idea that the wolf is a metaphor for humans. So in a lot of their mythology, they actually used wolves both as an example of good and an example of evil to teach morals. And so these myths were essentially teaching people how to be moral and using the wolf as a metaphor for human beings. And so lastly, we want to talk about the Native Americans and their non-hierarchical idea of nature, and how they, because they were living off of the land, specifically the hunters and gatherers, they saw themselves as part of nature. And so therefore they had this idea that, the wolf had its place, the human had its place, and they were all working together. And this contrasts directly to the Euro-American Christian view of wilderness and of the wolf. So firstly, Christians, in William Cronin's Trouble with Wilderness, he wrote in 1995, he discussed how the history of Euro-Americans and the Bible had this implication of wilderness. And so they talked about how in the Bible, the wilderness was where someone went to have this moral confusion, and it was a savage place. And so this directly relates to how people saw the wilderness back then, as Dr. Knickerbocker discussed. However, later in the 1800s, they started to have this idea that wilderness was actually a place where someone went to see the face of God. And so there was these two ideas. But essentially, what Cronin discusses is that because of this history of a savage place or even a godlike place, there is this inherent idea that people and nature are separate. And so you can directly see this in the way people treat wolves. And wolves in Euro-American culture are definitely a symbol of wilderness. And so, on the bad side, they see wolves as this savage, vicious creature. And so in all the fairy tales that we've heard, Little Red Riding Hood and The Wolf and the Seven Children, there is this wily, cunning wolf that is trying to attack little children. And ultimately, he is defeated by some brave and smart man who outwits him and saves the children from being eaten. And so on the other side, there are, as the perceptions of the wolf started to change, so did the stories and so did the idea of the wolf. And so ultimately it became this noble, courageous, majestic creature that was actually very beautiful, and it reflected wilderness. So as this relates to kind of the three interest groups we were talking about, this ties directly into the environmentalists and the conservationists. So on the extreme, again, as I said, there are like the animal rights activists who definitely see the wolf as something that they want to identify with on a personal level. And so they identify these characteristics of the wolf, that they're brave and noble and beautiful and a social creature. And so they use this, and they really value it for that fact. However, Cronin discusses this again. He says that this is kind of the trouble, is that then you are disconnecting people from the wilderness, from nature, and they're saying that they're inherently different. And so, if you want to go to the next one. There are a lot of environmentalists who are focusing on bridging the gap between this human-nature divide. And so they're focusing on emphasizing the importance of wolves in the ecosystem, and the importance of, this fact that the wolf is not necessarily an evil, vicious creature like some people are saying, but it is a wild animal, and it has its role within the ecosystem, which includes killing animals. And so they try and kind of look at this subject matter when they're discussing the wolf.
Okay, so I focused on one viewpoint that the hunters have towards the ranchers. They view as wolves. They view them as competitors. A reason behind this is they fear that the wolf will outcompete them. And since hunting has been a way of life, they disagree with any kind of reintroduction. Another point why ranchers have view wolves as competitors is hunting has become difficult for them. They state that they're unable to see elk herds that once were there. The last viewpoint that they have is they tend to have an anti-government attitude. Since wolf reintroduction has been funded and supported by the government, they totally disagree with this action. Ranchers. The main reason why ranchers disagree with wolves is they fear them. They fear that they'll lose their livestock because of different attacks. And if they lose their livestock, their income will have a rapid decline. However, this fear should be somewhat eliminated because defenders of wildlife have reimbursed them for their losses. Another reason why ranchers fear wolves is because they are unable to have them graze on public land. This will prevent preferred grazing patterns. Okay, coexisting. Even though ranchers and hunters disagree with wolves, they are here, and we should try to coexist with them by using different practices. So for hunters, they coexist by making offered a hunting season for them. If they participate in this, they will reduce the number of wolves, leaving more elk for them. As for ranchers, one method that they use for coexisting is burn pits. This is for the dead carcasses, and this will leave less attraction. Another way they can coexist with wolves is to use guard dogs. This prevents the wolves from attacking the livestock. A third method that they can use is to establish different types of fencing, such as philandering. Okay. The purpose of this temporary fence is to create a barrier between wolves and livestock. A fourth method that ranchers can use is to monitor their herds in the surrounding. A way by doing this is to check for different illnesses that will attract the wolves.
Okay, so Annie and I both, in our groups, but we're going to present it.
looked at the social perceptions of wolves, and we're first going to focus on how they're projected in our pop culture. So we found that in film and art, there's three major depictions of wolves, and the first one is of a ravenous wild beast, and that's portrayed in the movie The Grey. That wolves and humans cannot coexist together, and once the humans came into the wolves' territory, the wolves attacked, and that is awesome that wolves will not approach a big group of humans. And then the second depiction is in the movie Night of the Wolf, and this is where the wolves were romanticized as a wise and spiritual creature, and that they can. And in the movie, the wolf ends up helping the woman or the main girl in the movie. So it shows that wolves can help or can coexist with humans. And then our third example is of how wolves have been personified sexually, and the main it comes from multiple adaptations of the classic story of Little Red Riding Hood, and in this the wolf is not feared but instead an object of lust and desire. And so it just kind of those are three main ways that wolves are now depicted differently than they are before. And then another big thing in our pop culture is fashion. And with these new kind of unnatural ways of looking at the wolf, it transcended into the fashion industry. And it essentially gave the wolf as a symbol and not really gave it worth or value. So the wolf kind of lost its identity and individual characteristics, and now it's just a symbol. So pop culture really portrayed the wolf in kind of unnatural ways, and the media has also kind of depicted the wolf in two very different extreme ways, and it's all about the language we choose. And as we grow up and learn the language, we learn different connotations and denotations of the different words and phrases. And with this, the wolves have kind of developed this negative connotation as kind of like this wild, mysterious, complex, ravenous beast. And so we really gave it a negative connotation. With this, the anti-wolf media has really played up that fear. And so the anti-wolf media uses key phrases such as bloodthirsty, addicted to killing, to show that the wolf is not a very nice animal or we can coexist with it. And on one of the webs, or on saveelk.com, there's a quote on front center on the website saying, talking about how we shouldn't let the wolf invade our native wildlife, and that if we need to do something to stop this killing, this slaughter. And basically they're just trying to show that the wolf is an invasive species that's taking over this native habitat, when in reality it was part of the habitat to begin with. And the senseless slaughter kind of depicts that there are these wild animals that will kill anything that gets in its way, even humans, even each other if they go far enough. But the pro-wolf media really draws to connections, or draws an emotional connection to you and the wolf. And they focus on saying that since the wolf was taken out of the area, the habitat has been destructed, and by bringing back the wolf, the habitat will be restored, and we can all feel good about ourselves by restoring the natural habitat. They also draw a connection. They also draw a connection to our emotional status, as they try to make the wolves. Well, they give the wolves human characteristics that we desire and look for in leaders. And so an example of this is from Jim and Jamie Dutcher's website, Living with Wolves. They created a little profile of all the wolves they lived with. And underneath the picture, it had for the alpha wolf, it had that it was a benevolent leader, it was intelligent, it always responded first to threats. And these are everything that we look for in our own society and leaders and humans. And so they really play on that emotional connection to try to show that humans and wolves are very similar and we shouldn't be fearing them. And then another type of media is local and national.
And local is really influenced by the ranchers and hunters, as the reporters are usually from that area or friends or families of them. And so they also have to deal with the coexisting of wolves, so they have a really negative perception of the wolves, and they will do anything to show that wolves are bad. And so in Carter Niermeyer's book Wolfer, he was talking to a reporter about livestock killing, and the reporter said to Carter, you ruined a perfectly good story by stating the facts, saying that he ruined the article of the wolf killed the livestock instead of the livestock was killed by internal injuries. And so the local media really plays up the whole wolves are really negative, we need to get rid of them. The national media is more about restoring nature to what it was before, because they see it as something that we conquered, and that if we bring it back, then it's something we can go for to kind of get away from everything. And so they also see it as something to clear our guilty conscience for, since we eradicated them back years ago. And so the national media was really positive and trying to kind of restore nature to what it was.
Okay, so we've looked a little bit about how media, language, and pop culture influence and reflect perceptions of wolves, and some of our group also wanted to look into some of the social tensions in the wolf debate and some of the misunderstandings and disputes that have widened the divide between pro and anti-wolf factions. So one of the things that we looked at was misinformation, and we looked back to 1800 when a lot of wild reports started to blame wolves for livestock kills, but a lot of those wildlife reports were unverified. Nobody ever actually investigated to find out if a wolf was indeed responsible. So it's hard to know now, which ones were really killed by wolves. But there was a recent study in the late 90s, which examined the skulls and pelts of notorious livestock killing wolves, specific wolves that had been hunted down and killed, and their pelts were put in museums. But the authors of this study, upon examining the skulls and pelts, found that the ages of the wolves didn't match up with the time span in which they had supposedly been killing livestock. So we know that there was some misinformation going on there. Also, some official documents that should have had accurate information haven't. And some U.S. biological surveys starting in 1915 are known to have inflated the instances of wolves killing livestock. Because if they didn't make this perceived as a huge problem, they wouldn't get funding for their rodent and predator control departments. So we know that there were public information reports that were wrong, and so that hasn't helped the wolf's image at all. Also, we know that there are other predators that kill a lot of livestock and kill a lot of elk, like cougars and coyotes and bears, and the wolf might be killing some livestock, but it definitely gets blamed for more than its fair share sometimes. So that also contributes to kind of a negative image. And then further complicating public perception of wolves is a tension between conservationists and environmentalists, and then people with more traditional Western values. And there's kind of a long-standing debate about what we should prioritize when it comes to natural resource management and what role the natural environment should play in our management decisions. And so, whether you value, individualism or industry, or viewing the ecosystem as a whole and health and diversity, the wolf has kind of inherited a side of that debate with the conservationists and environmentalists. So rather than being judged based on its own, pros and cons, it's kind of part of this larger argument. So another thing that we thought would be interesting to do would be to look at other regions where wolves exist, kind of look at how long wolves have been there, and look at how public perceptions differ. So we kind of started in neighboring states, and what was interesting, and these are generalizations, it's going to vary from place to place, but it seemed that from public perception surveys, places that have recently had wolves just in the last 15 or 20 years tend to have the most negative perception of them. And a lot of those are rural areas with a lot of ranches. Areas that don't actually have wolves but maybe could have wolves in the future, like Western Washington, tend to have the most positive perception. But this was interesting because these states, in this region have none of them have had wolves for more than a couple decades. So then it was interesting because we looked on a kind of nationwide scale, and I know the political group is going to talk about this a little bit more, but you can see that most of the states in blue have known wolf populations. The states in green may have wolf populations or probably will in the future. And the states in tan have no documented wolf populations. So you can see that mostly it is the states in the West, and that could create some tensions between the West and the federal government and kind of the rest of the country in that debate. But what was interesting to look at was Minnesota, because Minnesota is the only state on the continent that hasn't ever extirpated its wolves. And the public perceptions of wolves in Minnesota were very different than in the West. And actually, according to public opinion surveys, which were on the Department of Natural Resources page for Minnesota, people view wolves as ecologically important, recreationally appealing, and important for future generations, and only a small minority fear or dislike them. And they've actually been recovered biologically for over a decade in Minnesota, but nobody really bothered to get around to delisting them until last year. So it's interesting how the public perception differs in a place that's had wolves for a long time. And then you see this on a worldwide scale also. One of the things we read for our class was Thomas McNamee's book, Return of the Wolf to Yellowstone. And he mentions in his book that in northern Italy, where they've had wolves for as long as anyone can remember, wolves aren't viewed as negatively, and people just kind of deal with them. But in southern Italy, where wolves have been gone for a while and they're starting to come back, there's a much more negative perception. Also, I looked at a study that was specifically looking at the opinions of teenagers in Europe about wolves. And it was interesting because the teenagers in the UK, in areas that didn't have wolves or didn't have very many or hadn't had them for very long, although they were overall still pretty accepting of wolves, they demonstrated the most fear and uncertainty. But teenagers in rural Spain, areas that have a lot of agriculture and livestock, actually had the highest acceptance and love of wolves and thought they were very important to have them in their country. So it seems just kind of generally that areas that have just had wolves in the last, decade or so tend to have a more negative perception. Places that don't have any wolves at all tend to have a more positive perception, and places that have had wolves for a long time tend to have the most positive perception. And that can't necessarily predict how attitudes will change in Idaho, but it does give us some idea that the length of time that people have put up with wolves or enjoyed wolves does have something maybe to do with how we view them. So that's our part of the presentation. Thank you.
Yes. I'm Anna, this is Cami, and together with Megan and Katie, we looked at the political and economic implications and components of wolf reintroduction. So it wasn't really until the late 1960s that the ecological and symbolic importance of wolves really started to surface on a national level. And as a result, the gray wolf was one of the first animals that was placed on the Endangered Species Act in 1973. And in 1982, the ESA was amended to include Rule 10J. And Rule 10J is really important because it essentially says that reintroduced species are managed differently than species that kind of naturally come back in and are endangered. And 10J classifies the reintroduced wolf populations as non-essential experimental populations, which means that they are not protected exclusively as endangered, and that states can play a role in wolf management so long as it is agreed upon with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So in a way, this 10J rule is really kind of a compromise between the placing wolves as exclusively endangered and enabling them to be killed under certain circumstances. And this was kind of more beneficial for some of the anti-wolf interest groups because if they were reintroduced, they were able to be killed under circumstances where if they had colonized naturally, like the biological group was talking about, they would be most likely classified as exclusively endangered. So in 2005, there were revisions to the 10J rule, and so this is for Idaho and Montana, instead of no longer having to first exhaust non-lethal ways of managing wolves, they could just kill them without first exhausting those non-lethal ways. And additionally, wolves could be killed for having unacceptable impacts on wild ungulates, but this was only if wolves could be kind of proven as the main main reason for wild ungulate populations not meeting the management criteria. And kind of also, like the biological group said, there are a lot of factors that contribute to ungulate population decline that can't be solely contributed to wolf presence. And probably the most ambiguous revision to 10J was that the wolf does not really need to be in the actual act of killing livestock or act of attacking livestock in order to kill the wolf. It was expanded to including chasing, molesting, or harassing the animal, and that's really subject to a lot of different interpretations and how people legitimize killing wolves based on what constitutes harassment, what constitutes animal molestation. And finally, the 10J revisions also allowed citizens to kill wolves if the attacks were on livestock or dogs, whereas previously it was confined to livestock attacks. So wolves have been delisted many times, as Dr. Knickerbocker said in the introduction. In 2008, 2009, and 2011 in Idaho and Montana, wolves were delisted from the ESA. And this gave states the management control, and in 2004 for Idaho and Montana, their state management plans were approved. But many interest groups, particularly for pro-wolf causes, they really wanted wolves to be relisted on the Endangered Species Act. So there were times kind of in between delistings where wolves were relisted on the ESA, but still under Article or Rule 10J, which did give some ability to kill wolves in certain circumstances. And by 2012, the entire northern Rocky population of wolves was delisted, and wolves were managed under the states in Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, which had their state management plan approved in 2012, and pockets of Washington, Oregon, and Utah. And that's the status right now, but there is talk, like very recently, that has been to delist wolves throughout the United States, and this would really probably affect their recolonization into areas like Colorado, more into Utah, and moving in their kind of natural ways to spread across the U.S. The history of wolf eradication in the U.S. So in the early 1900s, wolves were eradicated from the western United States, and that was largely federal government sponsored. And when wolves were reintroduced in 1994 and 1995, and the years kind of leading to that wolf reintroduction by the federal government, it was really seen as a shift in the prioritizing of values of the Old West and land and resource maximization, and the focus on the ruralite and the American rancher, to those of the New West, which were really representative and included more of the values of environmentalists, urbanites. And so it's really kind of compounded the hostility to the federal government, because in years leading up to the reintroduction plan and creating the environmental impact statement in 1992, public opinion surveys and forums were held throughout the United States, and that elicited the largest public response to a proposed federal action that had been seen up until that point in 1992. And most of the support for wolf reintroduction was from urban areas, and they were seemingly really disconnected from the adverse effects that wolves were really going to have on the local populations in the West. And if you think back to the map that the social group just showed a minute ago, it's really disconnected from the West where wolves are actually present. And so that compounded federal disdain when wolves were actually reintroduced to these areas, and rural interests have largely been more reflected in state management plans that are ideologically and physically kind of more connected to the interests of the ruralite and the western rancher or farmer or hunter. And one example of state backlash kind of being representative of some of the anti-wolf sentiments were seen in the late Idaho Congresswoman Helen Chenoweth's remarks on wolf reintroduction as a unconstitutional act because it was seen as religious environmentalism that was not separating church and state, and that was specific to how Nez Perce Indians had a kind of spiritual connection with wolves, but that may not be entirely true, and it's just an example of voicing sentiments that are anti-wolf and probably more in the interest of local anti-wolf groups. So, turn it over to Cami.
So as we come into talking about federal and state management plans, we kind of see this shift in public attitude from one on a federal level of viewing the wolf as a menace to society that needed to be eradicated in support of livestock industry to an overall very supportive attitude on a national level of reintroduction. So a study done by the U.S. Wildlife and or by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife found that people who were living more in urban areas, especially across the United States in large cities such as like New York and LA, places where people were not directly involved with wolf reintroduction, were actually more supportive of the process than people who are actually living directly in rural areas such as livestock and ranchers who were directly affected by the wolves when they're being reintroduced. So one of the main ways that public voices were really heard was through the creation and formation of various grassroots organizations. And so many of these organizations were formed by channeling common interests among individuals as a group to really focus on a political level. So, and additionally, these groups were also some of the main leaders for getting wolf reintroduction running politically, as you can see through the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, which was really responsible for making sure that wolf reintroduction was successful back into the Yellowstone ecosystem. So as we see the formation of these different grassroots organizations on a local level, we see a lot of different varying social outlooks on how wolf reintroduction should be supported or also anti-wolf reintroduction. So some of the grassroots organizations that were against wolf reintroduction was the Idaho Anti-Wolf Coalition, which had kind of an outlook towards wolves as being very sadistic. Their leader was quoted as saying that wolves were straight from the devil. And also you had the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, which kind of showed a view of hunters as being anti-wolf because they were afraid that wolves were going to affect hunting populations. Some other groups that were very pro-wolf were also supported here in Idaho for wolf reintroduction were groups like the Idaho Conservation League, the Wilderness Society, and the Defenders of Wildlife. The Defenders of Wildlife was a really good group to look at because they were really responsible for helping find common ground between different political groups. They had a really good way of being able to form better ties with the livestock industry through a compensation program that gave ranchers money in exchange for wolves or for having their cattle eaten by wolves. So another thing that we looked at too was the economic and quantifiable costs of wolf reintroduction. So when looking at any issue, it's important to look at the costs and benefits, and quantifiable benefits are those things that can be put into monetary terms or with a price value. So one of the main benefits of wolf reintroduction was the increase in ecotourism and the money that it brings in. And in 2005, there were about 95,000 visitors from outside the 3 states surrounding the Yellowstone National Park that brought in money specifically related to seeing wolves. Also, about $35.5 million were spent inside these 3 states surrounding the park. And also there was an increase in residential housing between the 70s and 90s, and this is predicted to continue to go up because people are choosing to live in these areas because it has a more intact ecosystem. As well, this also brings more money into the local economy. So, as we look at the benefits, we also have to look at the costs of wolf reintroduction. So it is estimated that livestock compensation for wolves can cost anywhere from $69 to $160 per wolf based on the number of livestock in an area.
And the cost of wolf reintroduction itself was estimated to be anywhere between $10 and $15 million from the period of 1994 to 2025. And in Yellowstone alone, this cost is estimated to be between $200,000 and $1 million. So, non-quantifiable factors of wolf reintroduction are also important to take into account. Excuse me, because these are things that cannot be easily quantifiable. So, a few benefits of wolf reintroduction are that wolves provide food for many scavenger species. They also help reduce disease in ungulate populations. And so more wolves means more genetic diversity among populations, as well as reintroduction has increased education about the natural world and predators in general. So some of the costs of wolf reintroduction on this side of things are the threat that wolves may pose to ranchers and farmers. And this comes with the possible emotional connection that ranchers and farmers can have with their livestock and pets, and also the angst that people may feel from knowing wolves are in closer proximity to their home. So another thing that we looked at was also the current status of wolves in Idaho. So currently, as of December 2012, there are 683 wolves in Idaho, which are 117 packs. And of these 117 packs, a minimum of 66 produced litters. And of these 66 that produced litters, 35 qualified as breeding pairs, and there were 187 pups that were introduced or produced in 2012. So this picture shows a map of all the wolf packs in the northern Rocky Mountain area. Each black circle represents a wolf pack, and then the gray areas represent areas that are managed by the National Park Service. So as you can see, there's quite a large distribution of wolf packs throughout the western states. So in 2012 and 2013, the hunting season brought in the Idaho, there are 13 different zones for hunting and trapping. So all 13 zones are open at some point for hunting, with dates that end January 31st, March 31st, and June 30th. And so hunters are allowed to purchase 5 tags or calendar year in 7 zones, but only 2 tags per calendar year in 6 zones. So as of April 25th, 2013, there were 197 wolves that were harvested, which is actually a less number than was harvested last year, which was 255 wolves, which was also taken on the same day of the same year. So, ensuring the continuing success of wolf reintroduction. So one of the main things that we really need to make sure that organizations such as the ICL and Defenders of Wildlife have are access to accurate information. Being able to find a middle ground, being pragmatic and realistic about the situation concerning wolf reintroduction means having good communication with one another, and also being able to know what is true and what is not concerning media effects, and also being able to implement biologically sensitive hunting seasons and quotas to make sure that there is a viable population among wolves to continue the success of this conservation story.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks for bearing with the wind and all that. At least it didn't rain on us. Are there any questions? And there is more food, so feel free to, while people are asking questions, to fill yourselves with food. And I'll give the mic I'll just throw the mic in the air, and whoever catches it will have to answer it. Dr. Ingersoll.
What would the group decide going forward as let's say, a hunting policy for the greater Yellowstone ecosystem or into Idaho?
Well, hunting's not allowed in national parks, but when outside, okay. Who wants to answer that?
Well, we talked about wolves, like they should fall under the kind of same classification as other large predators, and just like mountain lions and bears have hunting seasons, we think that wolves also should. And just as long as they are kind of making sure, like Cami talked about, that they're being biologically sensitive, and that they aren't like hunting seasons aren't really going into like mating seasons or like times when wolves are biologically productive, then like they should be having like hunting seasons. And I know that kind of is pretty controversial, but just as far as like maintaining its status as other large predators, we think that there should be a hunting season. Does that answer your question?
There are a diversity of opinions amongst the group. We don't all think exactly the same way, but it seemed like a general consensus was that there should be a hunting season, but that we do have to manage wolves, right? Partly through hunting.
Regarding the management of wolves and the trophic cascades and so forth, what should the Idaho Fish and Game Department choose as the ideal elk populations upon which to judge the ideal wolf population, therefore make those decisions?
Brittany?
Well, I don't personally know what the elk population in Idaho is right now.
Does anybody?
You said 10,000 was in the park.
There's 10,000 in Yellowstone, roughly.
There are many disagreements.
Yeah. Do you want to answer?
Okay.
I guess like thinking about as a management sense, like we discussed before, where if we're going to keep wolves at a biologically sound place, then I would say same with the elk. We probably would want to do the same, where we want to find maybe a correlation between how many wolves an elk would make the ecosystem biologically sound. So if that means one wolf to every 100 elk, then that would be your range of where you should keep the elk populations.
Just to kind of number throw, but I think
That was number throwing.
correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we generally agree that more studies should be conducted to really get a sense of how many elk there are, because certainly elk numbers are down since reintroduction of wolves, but how down is controversial, because elk are behaving more like elk used to when there were wolves, and that they're hiding out in the woods and not coming out into meadows, and so it's harder to hunt them. But that doesn't mean they're necessarily below a healthy population number for elk. So there are disagreements out there about the number of elk. So that's the first thing we'd all, I think, really encourage, is just more accurate data concerning the number, and then we'll answer your question, Dr. Mansfield. Other questions? What's that? Yeah.
I'm actually surprised you asked that question, because you're a biologist, and we talked one day when I was in the class about, teasing you, Don, but that because elk have different habitat in different places, and I think they read an article touching on that, and so it varies in those different locations. And also they talked about briefly that elk were reintroduced in Idaho from herds out of Yellowstone, and so following the population trends since the 1920s is an exercise in fluid equilibrium, right? So, yeah, you were provoking them. Yeah, so he was.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon. Colton, question? Your mouth is full.
I think that wolves shouldn't be managed at all. Is that anyone's opinion?
Yours, maybe, Colton? Anybody want to answer that? Kier?
I think we just kind of. Oh, sorry. Okay. Right here. Okay. We just kind of had a brief thing, and I think we're, in terms of not managing wolves, I think at the moment and in like the near foreseeable future, they should always be managed, just due to the fact that we're still working on getting like a viable population size. We're also still working on changing public opinion, and until we've changed public opinion, wolves are kind of in danger, if that makes sense. There's a lot of negativity towards wolves, and I think that can also potentially harm them, and until that's kind of simmered down a little bit, I don't think it would be a good idea to not manage them. Would anyone else like to?
There's also non-lethal and lethal method. Non-lethal method to use, what are the
Okay, and yeah, what Arnold is talking about is that there are lethal and non-lethal methods to kind of dealing with wolves if you're a rancher. And non-lethal obviously are the ones that are good, yes. And once those are kind of well practiced and are distributed around kind of the entire western United States, I think that potentially they should be managed just for their own benefit.
I mean, I know management policy is itself a management policy too, so not to venture too far into the land of paradox, but to not manage them is itself a management decision. Yes, Dr. Dixon?
I don't know if you came across this when you were researching, but in the cost listing, right, you talked about payments to livestock owners and ranchers for wolf losses, right? Supposed wolf losses that research. Is there any record of compensation for other kills? Because I think you also looked at data that said the percentage of wolf kills, right, is minuscule compared to other losses. Is there any effort at compensation made for like cougar losses or bear losses or other things like that? I mean, is that a fair comparison, I guess?
I was kind of in charge of the quantifiable costs, and one thing I didn't really quite go into detail as that. I'm sure there are some compensations for it. One thing that I did find that was interesting was it was $69 per wolf per year for a livestock kill, and that was only in wilderness-rich areas. It was higher in areas where livestock had to coexist with wolves. It was about, I think the number was $169 per wolf per year. So that was kind of interesting, is that it depended on where it goes. And I'm sure with other predators, there is probably some compensation, but I don't think there's as much information out there because people don't worry about the other predators as much. These wolves are now reintroduced, so it's not a big deal as other predators.
As far as I know, there isn't compensation for predation losses other than from wolves. Yeah.
I forget what the awful game was, but when he was here, he talked about how they open the hunting season
Yeah.
up a lot. Like, how does that look going into the future? Like, what do you guys think about that?
Okay, did you all hear that? So when Carter Niemeyer was here, he mentioned that the hunting season is open on wolves, and your question is, what about the future status of wolves, given that we can hunt them now and there's movement to increase the...
Well, not just hunting now, but hunting during the
Right. Yeah. Do you think that, are you asking, is the plight of the wolves even more, is it pretty dire now? What do you think? Do you think that the current hunting management policy is doomsday for the wolves or not? This is obviously a very speculative answer, but someone's going to try to answer this.
So basically, all we have required with the wolves is that we have to keep that minimum 300 level that they introduced, which scientists were involved in the decision-making process for that. So that number should be a fairly biologically sound number. The main concern is that if the hunting is at such a level that it prevents individuals from dispersing from pack to pack, that could be really detrimental, because then you wouldn't have gene flow. And of course, because of the eradication, these wolves are already at a pretty precarious state when it comes to the genetic diversity. And so I think that the numbers are okay as long as it's managed in such a way that it's not prohibiting all gene flow. And I think the breeding pair is the main thing too, because those tend to be the alpha wolves, and if you're hunting the alpha wolves, that tends to cause the pack to go into a little bit of chaos. So I think in terms of numbers, it's probably on the edge of being okay, and the main thing is just that we need to make sure it's managed in the best way possible from there.
Other questions? Christina. Okay. Question about corridors. Has anyone done any reading or research on the advantage of corridors linking different wilderness areas or ecosystems where wolves thrive? And is that fair? Okay. Anything about corridors? Linking up?
I can try to answer.
Okay.
we didn't really talk specifically about like establishing corridors for wolf populations, but wolves are pretty resilient, and we have talked a lot about how they can naturally recolonize in areas, and that they can live in a lot of different areas. So long as wolves are effectively managed, and like I said, there has been talk about completely delisting wolves, which could maybe like hinder their spread into areas where they aren't necessarily there right now. But as long as wolves kind of are under good management and at least somewhat protected in areas where they could potentially enter to, I think that they have a pretty good adaptability, and that they would be able to like, get into those areas.
And with or without corridors, wolves, like many large mammals, leave the boundaries of where they're supposed to be. And so the phrase lone wolf is a misnomer. They're naturally inclined to be pack animals. So this one wolf you may have heard about left Idaho and traveled all the way across Oregon into Northern California looking for a pack. And I think, or maybe he wanted to go surfing. Then he turned around and now he's on his way back, still in search. Poor wolf. So with or without corridors, I think wolves tend to, one of their attributes is dispersals, I think was mentioned earlier, so they tend to spread out.